Welcome, and thank you for taking time out of your day today to come join us in our 10th anniversary symposium. Speaking for all of us at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability, I can say we're just really gratified by the turnout and pleased that you're all interested enough in our topic to want to spend time here this afternoon. My name's Peter Bachland. I'm the Associate Director of SOGIS, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. And so that's my main function here, is to be the traffic cop for our discussion. I'm really excited about the panel, and I'm excited about the topic. So we're going to be talking about the Green New Deal, and I just wanted to give a couple of very brief clarifying remarks about the Green New Deal and what we're talking about here. And I think it's important to have a little bit of factual baseline about what this is all about. Okay, and the Green New Deal that everyone is talking about now is actually a resolution introduced in both the House and the Senate. It's about 14 pages long. It's an aspirational resolution that mixes together and calls for, defines the problem of climate change and other societal problems, and then calls for a very ambitious set of actions to address climate, economic inequality, and healthcare, basically. It has a lot of factual information mixed in there, but it's about 14 pages long, and it is definitely not a bill. It's not a legislative proposal for action. It's much more of what you might call a symbolic resolution or an aspirational resolution. The Congress does this kind of thing a lot to kind of go on the record about the importance of issues. And so really what this is about is the importance of the issue, but I think it's very important to recognize. So it was introduced by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez in the House and Ed Markey from Massachusetts in the Senate. But it's important to realize that there's been just a vast number of people that have contributed concepts and ideas that are now packaged up into this Green New Deal resolution. There's been a lot of work in the Green Party around definition of a Green New Deal. There's been various pundits and opinion writers, most prominently Tom Friedman, who've spoken about this. There's been a lot of action in the UN system around, in the UN Environment Program around defining a Green New Deal, and now there's this effort in the US Congress. But I do feel it's important for us to recognize that this resolution drew on a large set of concepts that have been worked on for a long time by a lot of people. I would say from where I stand, as someone who spent a lot of time in DC working on these kind of issues, it's kind of exciting on the one hand to see a recognition in the Green New Deal that environmental issues are linked with other societal and economic issues, and see kind of an attempt to package these together. On the other hand, it's very ambitious, and it is mixing together a lot of issues, and the strength of the linkages amongst the issues, I think, varies really. But it's, so in many ways I find it daunting personally, but very inspirational. But the real thing you're here to hear about is what our panelists think about it. And we have three great panelists for this discussion. Right to my left here is Doug Cloud. He's a professor in the English department here at CSU. He's a rhetorician, and he can correct me if I get this wrong, but to me that's basically someone who understands language around persuasion and arguments that work, and the way people use language to advance their points of view. And so I think just by what I said there, you could see there could hardly be anyone more appropriate to opine on this kind of an issue than Doug, and he's done a lot of work around the rhetoric of climate change and sustainability and environmental stuff, and he's a big contributor. He's an affiliate faculty member at SOGIS, big contributor to our school, so we're pleased to have him here. Next to him is Ed Barbier. He's also a professor here at CSU. He's an economics professor. He is one of the vast number of people that I just talked about that developed a lot of ideas that have now been incorporated into this, although I don't think the resolution is exactly the way he would have crafted it, but he's a deep and broad thinker on these issues, and he's going to come at this from a more economic perspective, I think, but he's done a lot of work on the economics of sustainability and environmental economics, and we, again, are very pleased to have him here. And then finally, Maggie Fox. She's a member of the SOGIS. Actually, let me say one more thing about Ed. He's an affiliate faculty member at SOGIS. He's also a SOGIS Senior Scholar, which is the highest academic recognition that our school can give. We only have a few of them, and he's one of them. Maggie is on our external advisory board for our school and is really a key member there. She's always bringing us back to the reality of things and keeping us from getting too academic on everything, and we really appreciate that. I can hardly begin to describe all the different things that she's done, but most recently she was the former CEO of the Climate Reality Project, which, as you all know, is the effort set up by Al Gore to really publicize and stimulate action on climate change. She's a former deputy executive director of the Sierra Club. She's really a senior member of the environmental community, and more important than that, a very thoughtful member of that community. So you can see we have three panelists that are going to come at this issue from different perspectives. I'm going to ask them to start by giving a little more background on themselves and their lens on the issue and what they think about it. Then we'll have a little discussion back and forth and throw it open to Q&A from the audience. So I hope you all have a lot of questions and answers, because the better your questions are, the better our session will be. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug and let him say a little bit, and then I'll wave at you when your time is up.
Sounds great. No red light available then?
No red light.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. I'll start by explaining why I sound the way I do. You might think it's because I am recovering from an illness, but actually it's because I have a deep, abiding upper respiratory passion for sustainability discourse. So sorry about that. So as Peter mentioned, I am a rhetorician. There's no second T in there by training. And what that means is that I study persuasion and argument. It also means that for me, rhetoric isn't a dirty word. That's often the context in which you hear it on the news, right? Ooh, rhetoric. Not how I see it at all. Rhetoric, persuasion, argument, these are really the only known alternatives to force in terms of getting people to act in coordination with one another. We've got a big and complicated set of problems before us, so we're going to have to work together to confront them. When I talk with sustainability scientists, I try to remind them, and myself really also, that rhetoric and public controversy and politics are not necessarily things that we want to lament. They're par for the course, and they're the best tools that we have for solving shared problems. So that gives you a sense of the framework that I'm approaching it from. Being a rhetorician also means that I'm coming at the Green New Deal from the perspective of argument. And not to get too cynical about it, but you might think of me as asking, will the Green New Deal be seen in this way or that way? Will it be seen to be a bold path forward, an idealistic pipe dream, an insane boondoggle, an inspired fever dream? Who knows? The question of whether the Green New Deal is practical or bold or nuts or whatever is a human judgment, right? It dwells in the realm of rhetoric. And that means that in a lot of ways, this question that is at the center of the panel today is to be determined. We can't look at a non-binding resolution or an aspirational resolution, or even if we had specific bill proposals in front of us, and determine on the contents alone whether they are this way or that way. So this is a moment where broad public judgment is beginning. If we want to make some predictions, we might look at history and look at the New Deal. So I spent some time reading FDR's 1932 acceptance of the Democratic presidential nomination. And that is the speech in which he coined the phrase, "A New Deal for America." And it's pretty startling how many phrases you could lift out of the New Deal and they would be perfectly at home in discourse about the Green New Deal. And in fact, if you approach me after the panel, I will be happy to play a round of New Deal or Green New Deal with you. I've pulled out some. And then the last thing I want to say is that if we hope to talk about the Green New Deal substantively, it may help to have another distinction in our back pocket. We have really at least two different kinds of challenges facing us. On the one hand, we've got a set of technical challenges, things that we have to figure out how to do with the level of technology and technical know-how. We have a pretty good track record as a species of solving technical problems. So that's the good news. Do we have the technological means to make our economy carbon neutral by 2030 or 2050? An important question. But we also have, for lack of a better term, more ideological challenges in front of us. Can we agree to commit to actions like the Green New Deal? Are we willing to make sacrifices in the short term to ensure long-term benefits to our shared civilizations? Can we agree on what our goals are? Can we do it fast enough? So the answer is within us, and I can't think of a better question to be asking on this panel. Thank you.
Ed.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Peter. Well, I've been working on issues of green growth, greening the economy, and sustainable development for more than 30 years. In 1989, myself, David Pierce, and Anil Markandia published a book called Blueprint for a Green Economy. So even then, we were thinking about how do we go from a brown economy to a green economy and what policies are needed. So I'm going to offer a policy and economic perspective on the Green New Deal. Based on that Blueprint for Economy book, Green Economy book, and for other work I've done on green growth and sustainable development, during the Great Recession of 2008-2009, I was asked by the UN Environment Program to write for them a report on a global Green New Deal. And this term, as David was pointing out, was already in vogue and being used, Green New Deal, but they wanted a global Green New Deal. So I looked at the various programs of green stimulus and other policies that were being advocated as part of the economic recovery. And in this report, I basically argued we need to do better, we need to do more, we need to do something about the incentives that work against greening the economy, which is the same message I was saying in 1989 with my colleagues. That report was eventually published in 2010 by Cambridge University Press. And on the basis of that work, when the latest Green New Deal craze came along, which was, as everyone knows, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and now Ed Markey proposing the Green New Deal for the United States, I've been asked to comment again on what do we do to make this work. So in January of this year, Nature asked me to write a piece for them about this, which I did, and they published. And then in February, I've written a longer piece for The Conversation, which many of you are familiar with, about how to pay for a Green New Deal. And for me, I think there are really four questions that matter, four issues from a policy perspective. There's a lot of stuff that's put into the Green New Deal. If you read the resolution or you look at the reports, all sorts of environmental social programs, including Obamacare, Medicare for All, and universal basic income are all in there. But for me, it's all about decarbonizing the economy. It's about making the transition from a fundamentally browner economy to one where green economies, the green sectors and industries become the fulcrum for a transition to more sustainable, particularly environmentally sustainable development. So how do we, in particular, use government spending as the linchpin in a Green New Deal to shift the U.S. economy away from its reliance on carbon and to more low carbon and cleaner technologies? And that also means we have to think about what are the type of public programs and investments that we need to foster this shift. We can't expect government to do everything. In fact, the role of government should be to foster the private sector to take the lead. That's where innovation and development occurs in our economy. That leads to the possible costs. You've probably seen in the press and in the media and by your favorite politicians all sorts of wild estimates about what this might cost. I believe it's not as expensive as we expect, or some of the estimates that have come out. One is because we conflate public and private costs. We don't talk about how much the government should spend as opposed to the private sector. I also think that we don't take into account the natural cost savings that occur once innovation gets going. And I'll explain about that in a second. And then finally, how do we pay for it? One of the important things is that it cannot be paid just by government alone. We have to think about incentives. And one of the most powerful incentives we have for Green New Deal would be something like a carbon tax. And the revenues earned by a carbon tax could be used to partly pay for the deal, but also to protect those who are hurt most by this kind of transition. And there will be losers as well as winners. And just to give you an idea of the cost savings, one of the things that I think is really frustrating in the Green New Deal debate is we set artificial timelines and goals. So you probably heard that one of the goals is to be either carbon neutral or 100% renewable by 2030. I think that's very difficult to plan for. I think what we should be planning for is the next 5 years. What does the first 5 years look like? And what do we need to get us on that path? And once we're on that path, good things will start to happen. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. We know that one of the things we need in a Green New Deal is to get electrical vehicles more widely popular and distributed. And to increase the demand for electric vehicles, we need charging stations. If we have charging stations, then the costs of electrical vehicles fall. And then people will want to use more of them, and then car manufacturers will produce more of them. That lowers the costs. That means that it's cheaper to buy. That will increase the demand. Then we'll need more charging stations. If we want to know why that works, well, we just have to go back 50 years and look what happened with the expansion of public highways, gasoline stations, and the internal combustion engine, which of course had the unfortunate effect of wiping out our railway system, which was a cheap and efficient way and greener way of transporting people and goods. So I'll just leave it there, and I'm happy to talk more about this as we go on this afternoon.
Thanks, Ed. Maggie?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, and fellow panelists, and thanks to all of you for coming. This is an event today, as I understand it, which is the 10th anniversary, or celebrating 10 years of SOGIS, and I want to congratulate Diana and the entire team, because I think SOGIS is an important part of this university and a very important part of the community, and the contributions are global. So thank you, and all of you for being here. Yeah. My role today is to be the resident rabble-rouser. My career in the environmental movement began by organizing on the Navajo and Hopi reservations when people forgot to bring their voices into a major land use decision that affected a sacred peak outside of Flagstaff. And from there, I went to the Sierra Club and ended up as a deputy executive director. I ran America Votes for a few years. And then I ran for almost 6 years the Climate Reality Project and the C4 that went with it. Now I'm a consultant. I've spent my entire career in the environmental world working in some way on climate change, even before we named it that. It began first with looking at impacts on public lands, wilderness, and other protected lands in the United States, and almost always we were fighting energy projects, which evolved over time to realize that that was a way of life here, whether we were fighting them on public lands or on private lands. There was a huge impact of energy, and that grew into this massive global question mark about a changing climate. So I see the Green New Deal as the newest step to engage this country and the world in the important conversation about what we're going to do about it. And so I'm applauding it. There is a lot of criticism and a lot of applause, but for me, I see it as another evolution of a long journey that we've been on to bring this question to the American people in this context in a way that they can comprehend it, or at least begin to engage themselves. What looks new to me, thank you for the history, both of you, because now I don't have to speak about it and you're more learned anyway. For me, it's bringing the significance of the individual voices of the most heavily impacted people. That is what AOC represents in this conversation. Voices that are not usually heard when it comes to where climate change impacts are going to be first felt. It's also a more personal version of the economic story that we're talking about here. It is also, by going to the floor of the Congress and putting out a revolution, inviting a political brawl. And we've already got it. McConnell is going to go for a vote in the Senate, not because he cares anything about climate change or the Green New Deal, but because he's going to force the 6 senators who are already declared candidates in the presidential race to declare themselves on the floor of the Senate. Because there's a lot in the Green New Deal that is imprecise, unclear, and has no boundaries. So if you are named supporter of it, you can be lambasted pretty hard in the course of a very tough presidential run between now and November of 2020. So the game is on. And someone like me who spent a lot of years of her career trying to get a conversation going in a presidential race about climate change, I'm thrilled. I'm totally thrilled. I have no idea where this is going. I think we're back to TBD. We have no idea where we're going as a country on this issue. We have no idea where we need to end up as a matter of public response. We know a lot of our goals, and we know what we need to do about shifting our economy. We know what lands we need to save. We know what we need to do on agriculture, and we're doing very little of any of it. And all of you know that. Most of you are probably here because you're very concerned about this and want to see from your perspective whether the Green New Deal gives us another tool, another opportunity, another handle, another lever. And I say Godspeed on all of that, because that's just what we need. There are weaknesses and there are strengths. The strengths are new voices, new forum. There hasn't been legislation since 2009, which died an ignominious, quiet death when Harry Reid called it over in August of 2010 after Obama was inaugurated in January 2009. There's been no other legislation in the Congress that anyone even knew about that dealt with climate change. So we have 9 years. 9 years in a time frame in which we have about 10 to 12 more years to actually turn some things around. So I'm with you with a 5-year goal plan. We don't have long-term goals right now. We have short-term versions of long-term goals. So to the extent that the Green New Deal is pushing energy into the system and forcing this conversation out in the open in a challenging way is a gift. In addition to that, I think that another strength is it brings in what you brought, which is the economic argument. One of the underlying anxieties, I think, that people feel all over the world tied to climate change is that we're moving into a 21st century when we have no idea what we're going to do for a living. Artificial intelligence is an unknown and strange thing to most of us, but there's anxiety about where we're going. What are my children or my grandchildren going to be doing? What am I going to be doing in 10 years? What is the world going to look like? And so that anxiety needs attention and conversation. And opening it up in the context of an economic discussion is a pretty good place to go, because we all want to be knowing how we make a living and how we have meaningful lives in a rapidly climate-changing world. And the last thing I'd say is the weaknesses. We have no answers. And when you throw out a resolution that opens the door to the appropriate, even though still too narrow width, about the impacts of climate change in our society here in the United States and around the world, into a body that's supposed to legislate, not just pontificate, then you're going to get attacked endlessly for the imprecision and the lack of information and factually strong proposals. So the strength of it is the narrative, and the weakness of it is the imprecision. And that imprecision is necessary because you can't have a new conversation laden with mountains of information. We're not capable of it. On the other hand, it's going to make for a tough playing field. And it will be, hopefully, a determining factor in how candidates perform in 2020. And that will make all the difference. Because whoever ends up on the other side of that line in November 2020 is going to have carried this fight with them for the first time in this country all the way to the finish line. And so I'm thrilled you're here, because we have to help push that conversation with this new opening cabinet. And so I view this as new voices in an old conversation that needs shaping, and all of us need to put our oars in the water and make sure it keeps happening.
Well, there's a lot to think about there, just on the basis of the opening statements, but one question that occurs to me very quickly after having listened to those perspectives is, and maybe this will kind of bring it full circle from Maggie back to Doug. Maggie, you just kind of explained the audacity of this and the potential value of putting a big concept in front of the public and in front of the Congress. Mm-hmm. And what I'm wondering about is what we know and how we feel about that, the value of going big versus maybe going more incremental and proceeding more carefully. And I think there's a lot of arguments on both sides of this, but I think one of the clear characteristics of the Green New Deal is it's going big with a big, audacious goal. And in particular, Doug, I'd be interested in your view on that as a rhetorical technique. What are the chances this is going to work? I find a great deal of resonance with Maggie's view on this, that this is a big issue and it's kind of inspiring to see people going big in defining the problem. But as a matter of rhetoric and argument, how does that tend to, do we have a knowledge base on how that tends to work out?
Well, probably a better knowledge base than mine might be people who are more versed in negotiation. A theorist that I had a conversation about this with once said that he called it almost like a Tea Party strategy. You ask for outrageous things, and you get things that are partly outrageous, which it certainly accords with conventional wisdom. I don't think it's possible to say whether it's going to be effective or not, but I think we can say with some certainty that there were a lot of things proposed in the last presidential election that were very radical and very surprising, and I don't think a lot of us could have or would have predicted things unfolding in the way that they did. So it's hard to say. One of the biggest things I think people criticize about this vagueness, the capaciousness, is why are these initiatives tied together into a green initiative? And there is a kind of a hiccup in the resolution when it switches from sustainability arguments to things like universal living wage or socialized medicine, but if you look at the New Deal, if you look at what FDR was saying, it's not really that much more of a stretch to include those programs under the same umbrella.
Ed?
Yeah, I take a slightly more pragmatic perspective, as you might expect being someone who's a policy person. One is that some grand concepts are fantastic, and I think Maggie's nailed it by saying this has opened an opportunity by opening our eyes to the possibilities. But at some point, possibilities has to be translated into policies. And the Green New Deal ultimately is going to be a policy document if it's going to be legislation and we're actually going to do something. So I think we need to be realistic. There's another reason for being, why I said we should think about what we want to do in a 5-year perspective, and that is that in the absence of coming up with something more concrete and policy-oriented and with actual numbers, our opponents of the Green New Deal, a little slip there, our opponents. I'm for the Green New Deal, by the way. I may be a critic of it, but it's something that I feel passionately about, like my fellow panelists. But having said that, if we don't start putting numbers on it and coming up with realistic policies, the opponents of the Green New Deal will do that, and they're doing that already. So, for example, as I alluded to in my opening comments, already you see wild estimates saying it's going to cost $12.3 trillion. I think that's an outrageous number, but it's because of the current vagueness of the proposal, it allows opponents of it to do exactly that, to say, to count up all the costs as if we're going to suddenly flip a switch and turn renewable overnight. That's not going to happen. And then secondly, to say, what are the costs way out until 2030 to do it, rather than to think about the first few years. My own estimates, which I have documented in my conversation piece, suggest that in a 5-year plan, we could spend $1 to $2 trillion and get this thing going. And we could do this very concretely and do it with specific government policies for supporting private sector research and development, for doing infrastructure investments like the one I talked about a minute ago, the charging stations and so forth. So at some point we need to move from rhetoric to reality. And once we get into reality, we have to talk about dollars and cents, how much it's going to cost, how do we pay for it, and what's the best way to do it to change, the distorted playing field to a more level one, in which we're not constantly favoring fossil fuels over alternative energy supplies.
I guess I'm with you, and I feel differently about it. I've spent most of my career, I think I've testified in front of the House and or Senate over 300 times or more in my career. I know what it's like. I know what the legislative process is like. And when we started after Obama, I co-led the entire national fight to pass that legislation. And it died for two reasons. One, healthcare took over and dominated and became a political football too big to make it past the first 10 yards, and everything else went down with it. In addition to that, the legislative package that was prepared was very carefully crafted, and it was 1,200 pages when it came out of the House Energy Committee, and it weighed itself down to die. Even if the politics of the health care bill had not killed it before it had a chance to die of its own weight, it would have died of its own weight. Because, and let me just say a couple things. I'm just sharing with you my mistakes and my lessons learned in 40 years of this work. The first is that we need strong, capable, smart policy people. And I'm a lawyer. I wrote policy, I gave testimony, but until we sell where we're going and how we're going to get there to the American people in ways they can comprehend, we can't get those policies through the Congress. Whether it's a brand new one in 2020 that's shaped more to a group that wants to solve this problem, there are enormous technical hiccups along the way. First, we have to get people on board believing that this challenge is real, which I think we're finally there, and then that we can solve it. What I think this new proposal does is open the door to some new voices, people who haven't felt they were even in the conversation, and are actually going to allow them. That's why the living wage stuff, and some of this is in here, which is we are actually in an interesting New Deal era in the 21st century. Even though we aren't seeing the economic downturn of 2008 and 9, we're all still living in fear of that. So before you can move people to policy, you have to persuade, seduce, and bring them with you so they will give you permission to write these complex policies and pass them. We've never accomplished that. In all the years of this work, we have not accomplished the goal of bringing people to believing this needed solving, and it needed solving now, and there were people they could trust to do it. Because there's a whole new set of voices and faces in the United States Congress, we have a chance of doing that in a new way, and we have a big election coming. So it's really incredible that this conversation is starting out this way, and I'm going to give it points for just starting out audaciously, because audacity is necessary to get attention in the world today. Otherwise, you're just lost in the massive information pouring at you and everyone. The other is that as audacious as this is, let's be real for a second. It's a tenth as audacious as it needs to be. It doesn't talk anything about true biodiversity. It doesn't really go in any great detail about agriculture. The biggest challenge we've faced in climate change is the inability of us as human beings to fully comprehend that we have shifted the entire planet and what that means. So when someone says wage issues are not important, I beg to differ with you. Bloody everything is important. It's that we can't handle it all at once. It's impossible. I worked on this for 40 years, and there's vast hunks of it I just can't visit. It's just beyond my ken, and I'm so grateful there are many other people doing it. So what this does is give us a chance to grab this audacious moment and ride this puppy as far as it'll go. And they get ready with another one and another one, because that is what we're going to have to do. We're just going to have to get on and ride hard and fast and respect the fact that there are new voices getting included in this one that haven't been there before.
I'd just like to say quickly, you know, that it's a gosh darn miracle that you're able to come up with a number that exists and is rooted in that kind of research. What was the projected 10-year cost of the recent tax cuts? Do you happen to know offhand?
Depends who you talk to.
Just pick one. Just pick a number.
Yeah, well,
They could easily be close to $1 trillion, yeah.
Yeah, so we're in the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
Oh,
more or
absolutely.
less. Yeah, and I'm skeptical of the degree to which arguments about specific numbers. I mean, there's a huge difference between 12 million and 12 trillion and 1.2 trillion,
Yeah.
or whatever. But I'm not sure that there is argumentatively for the public. I don't remember a whole lot of people saying we can't afford these tax cuts because they're going to cost $1.2 trillion or they're going to cost $1.2 thousand. It didn't even really seem to matter, which is disheartening in a way. It may be that these policies have to be argued for on moral grounds and not pragmatic grounds in certain contexts. The numbers are really important too.
Well, the numbers are important because they're being used against us who want the Green New Deal. And equally, how you pay for it is very important. Is that the original Green New Deal was talking about more deficit spending. Well, the problem with the tax cuts, why it's so difficult to put a number on those tax cuts, is that they've blown up our budget deficit to a huge government budget deficit to such a big degree that many economists, quite rightly, are worried about whether those are sustainable in the long run. If we add on a huge bill for a Green New Deal on top of that and push the deficit even further, we could be trading one type of unsustainability for another, which I think is dangerous. But I think there's a more important issue here, which is at some point we have to pay for it, all of us, not just by taxes, but we have to accept that we need to change the pricing of our market system so that we have a more level playing field. We've gotten used to having fossil fuels so cheap. And we've gotten used to subsidies that are hidden from us and that nonetheless play. I mean, Maggie's quite right. How we manage agriculture wastes so much money, and it's also unsustainable. Yet we don't have a public discourse on that. I really think that there is a lot to fix, and I also agree that the social programs in the Green New Deal are important. My interest right now, I think the priority right now, is that we do have a small window of time. The Green New Deal, as Maggie's pointed out, has opened that window and allowed us to have fresh ideas come in about how do we green the economy. But we only have a short period of time to do this before we may be in an irreversible situation, particularly with respect to massive climate change. So let's grab that opportunity now and come up with plans and a Green New Deal that is affordable and also can make an impact in the next few years and in ordinary people's lives. And I think that there's a way to do that. And it starts with the policy discourse we're having right now.
This makes me want to paraphrase one of the classic quotes about Washington, D.C., and I forget who it was, but it was a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, which is the committee in Congress that deals with the money and actually the expense of money. And in an earlier, long ago, more innocent time, he said $1 billion here and $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money, and I'm thinking $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, and we're starting to talk about real money. I think it's time to bring all of you into the conversation, and I think we have someone out here with a mic, and so if you want to pose a question to our panel, please feel free to do so, and let's please try and keep it more to questions and statements and identify yourself when you ask the question. And you first, sir.
Oh, okay. She doesn't want me to hold it too long.
She's experienced.
I'm Philip Chapman. I'm a professor emeritus of statistics here, and I've been interested in this topic for many years, and I feel pretty much like I've been a real loser with respect to this topic since 1980, I'm tired of being a loser on this topic. And I think Mitch McConnell pretty much has understood the politics of this, that it is a way for the Republicans to take back the House and retain the presidency. So I want to do something that can be done and that is a lot more modest. So there is a bill in Congress, and I'm sorry I forgot the number, 760 something in the House. It's going to be reintroduced in the Senate. And they label it carbon fee and dividend. But it's basically a tax on carbon, which achieves a lot of the goals you've talked about, but it gets rebated to individuals on a per capita basis. So anybody who uses a large amount of carbon, puts a lot of carbon in the air, will pay a lot of money. Anyone who uses very little carbon will just get a check. About 60% of the population will receive more than they pay. I'd like to hear the panelists' opinion on a bill like this, a more modest attempt to get something done. It has bipartisan support. Yeah, thanks.
Panelists, you want to comment on, I would even expand the question to go beyond taxes and include cap and trade, which is related to taxes.
I've read that bill, and I know about it. We're going to end up in some much more modest place legislatively, period. Nothing massive will move through the entire Congress. It just won't. It hasn't for a long time, and it particularly won't in a presidential year. It's just not going to happen. So the introduction of a bill in the House that has Republican support is in part caused by two things. Climate change is arriving on our doorsteps, and there's a set of conversations going on because of the Democratic Party and changing the voices in the House that have forced them out of 7 years of conversations about that bill. It was written 7 or 8 years ago and finally introduced. So any and all ideas need to be on the table so that we can actually legislate to do something. But whether or not we end up there or some other place, we just need to move. And that movement there would be no bill if we had not won the House.
So this is maybe an example also of the value of the audacious goal and stimulating action on the other side.
Hard to get them to move off of way beyond less than zero. And there's plenty of really good ideas out there. It's not that we have a marketplace on one set of ideas. It's that you have to move the other party to the table to get the conversation going about what legislation can pass.
I totally agree with that. You know, the famous saying, you know, you shoot for the stars, you may land on the moon. And that's exactly why we need the discussion to be audacious, to get policy proposals on the table, which 10 or 15 years ago were completely ridiculed, or if not just outright dismissed. Now, I have a colleague here, Anders Fremsted, who's written quite a lot on this basic idea, which is basically a carbon tax and then a dividend to all citizens. So please ask him more about some of the aspects of this proposal. But generally, there's two ways you can control carbon. One is to tax it, and the other is to do a cap and trade. Since Peter mentioned, I have to explain that now. Thank you, Peter. So a cap and trade says you cap overall emissions in the economy or a sector, but you allow the polluters to trade, and therefore you end up with some of them choosing to buy permits and pollute, and others cutting down emissions, so you achieve the overall goal. The difference between a carbon tax and why this bill is very important is that carbon taxes generate revenue, and you can use the revenue for something. And I think one way is to use the revenue, as in this bill, to pay a dividend back to all citizens, since after all, we're all going to bear the burden of it, and those that are worse off are going to bear the most of the burden, and that extra dividend is going to matter a lot to them. The other thing is to do something with the money that would actually promote moving to a more green economy, which I'm in favor of. I mentioned a number of investments that only government can do to help that transition, and that revenue could do that. But I'm in favor of both approaches. So I think you're right, and I'd like to see this Green New Deal conversation carry on, so we have more bills like that and more sensible policies, and we start moving the goalposts more and more. Thanks.
Another question? Looks like we have quite a few. We're going to switch to this side of the room, then we'll come back to this side. So,
I just wanted to complete the information about the last question. The bill is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and it is H.R. 763.
There's a young woman up here that had a question.
yeah.
Danny Lynn Hunter. I'm a graduate student in ecology. And one of the things that I was wondering is, I feel like a lot of the diction around this conversation has been a little bit divisive, like us, them, opponents, we, they. And I was wondering if the audacity of this is also part of what creates that climate, and how to create bipartisan support for something so audacious.
We have to tell an inclusive story about why these things are necessary and why they benefit everybody. What you're talking about, there's a lot of terms for it, right? In-group, out-group, naive realism, black and white thinking. A theorist in our field says that that really is where demagoguery lies. It isn't with demagogues, it's a condition of discourse where we are demonizing another group and eliminating them completely from a conversation, and that it takes place across the political spectrum. But really the only answer that's ever been proposed from within my field is identification, consubstantiality, creating a sense of we're made out of the same things in terms of values, in terms of material, everything. It's a cliche to say common ground, but that really is the only solution that we have.
I don't think audacity drives division. I think we do. I would agree with him. The only voice that's really missing on this panel is a behavioral scientist. And I think from my perspective of 40 years of advocacy, we should have spent a fraction of the money we've spent on climate science on social science. And we'd be in a lot better place. What moves us as human beings is very little of what we do to advocate. We don't advocate to move people. We advocate to get our point of view out there most of the time. That's most of all we do. And it's I think that was a grand answer. And I think the truth is we actually have to get a conversation going and get sick of feeling separate from each other. And I don't yet know how to do that without employing the reality of today, which is the partisan divide, until we reach a point where the impacts of climate are so close we reach to each other because we have no choice. There was a fascinating poem I read a couple of years ago about the only real response to climate change, like in the flood that occurred in 2013, I don't know if you were here, where we experienced flooding in this part of the state that was a tropical storm in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. And as a result, people came together, lasted for years. It still is happening. And it was very much of a climate partially created storm, an odd faction of a new climate, emerging climate. So I do believe you are right that we won't get to real solutions without coming together, but we've got to keep pushing to get the seriousness and the possibilities of what we can do together on the table before the opportunities to do that will occur.
Let's come back to a question over on this side of the room here, and then we'll come back to your side, I promise, before we're done. But we've got a couple people raising their hands over here. Maybe up here at the front, Laura.
Hello, I'm Richard Comrich, and I have a question for Margie. And the question is, how do we get the mainstream media to have the ability to explain this to the people in such a way that they are interested in solving the problem instead of hiding behind car and manufacturing ads and showing the latest fire or the latest speeder that got caught. How do we get this on the news? Because that's where it belongs. With all when the fire burned in California and Paradise was lost, 50,000 people were displaced.
Yeah.
That number should be repeated on the news every day. How do we do that?
Well, I wish I knew. I mean, in the end, there have been a lot of attempts to do that. I actually don't think the news media will ever be our friend in this. And I don't, until it reaches a point where it's disasters all the time, and so the disasters are all the news there is or something. And then I think it could become, they're going to need to package it and help us understand it. But I do think that media can become our friend by using what you might call more of the arts of entertainment, music, poetry, stories, books, plays. There's a performance after this where we use our creative endeavors to tell the story of climate, which actually also brings us together when news media in the form of news never does, but where the kind of entertainment that we seek of all different types is telling climate stories in a whole host of new ways, then I think then it becomes our friend, but not until that media is fully developed, and it's just starting. It's really just starting. I have 35 children's books written about climate change, but not written about climate change per se, but deeply embedded in those stories. Those children are never going to not understand. They're reading about it at 2.
Ed, do you want to add to that?
One of the big challenges for us as a human race is that major social change has always been reactive, not proactive. And if we think about the original New Deal, it was a reaction to a terrible crisis, man-made crisis, which was the Great Depression. The little effort that was done, and it was substantial at the time, on green stimulus was, and other government greening programs in 2008, 9, 10, were a reaction to the Great Recession, which at that time was considered, and still is, quite a calamity. With the Green New Deal, we're being asked to be proactive. We're being asked to do something now and incur costs and incur a far-thinking program of action before the crisis becomes irreversible. And that's the massive changes from climate change and other human disturbances to the biosphere. It's a huge challenge for us. We've never faced that. But I think that there is a role for all of us, policymakers, policy analysts, social thinkers, scholars in general, the ordinary men and women who are important to all of us, and also to the media, to actually point out that this is the time we have to act. It's an irreversible change that's coming, and we cannot be reactive. And that, getting back to your question, I think is what is missing from the media. They focus on the natural disasters and how do we respond in the same mindset. And we have got to challenge the media to think differently and think in a proactive way, because that's what we need in this case.
Yeah, I don't know if I would use the proactive-reactive divide to explain the difference between this and the New Deal. It makes some sense. I think that all crises and problems are...
Are you saying that the New Deal was not a reaction to the Great Depression?
No, certainly not. Certainly not. What I'm saying is that all problems are rhetorically constructed. It would be a mistake to say this problem is objectively apparent and we don't have to talk about it and the solution is obvious. The Great Depression was a name that gathered together disparate phenomena and made it present and important to people. It gave their suffering meaning, and therefore it also argued for the solution. I think the same thing can happen and is happening now. Reading FDR's talk about the New Deal, I keep thinking about that fear line, or as he would say it, FIA, with nothing to fear but fear itself. And what would be the equivalent of that for our times? And I wonder if it would be, there's nothing to be cynical about but cynicism itself. I don't know. Maybe somebody's got a better one.
That was a good try, though, Doug.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
I'll give you an A for effort on that. You like that. I think we have time for one last question. So
There's one right here.
where's my mic person?
There's a person right here.
There's two of them.
Let's go back to this side. Just pick one on that side.
There's a bunch of people up here.
Yeah, there are.
Hey, this is Carol, and I work here at CSU, and I work in sustainability. And one of the things, when we teach about sustainability, we always talk about social issues being one leg of the sustainability triangle. So I find it disheartening when we talk about that as if it's a separate piece. And I guess my question is, how do we implement a Green New Deal without bringing everybody to a point where they can have a conversation? If you're in survival mode because you're making minimum wage and working 3 jobs, you're not really too concerned about the economy 10 years from now or the climate 10 years from now. So it seems like those things are just as important, and I'd like your thoughts on that.
I didn't understand the question.
I think the question is, if I can paraphrase, the question is it important to include immediate societal concerns in this because they have such a profound effect on people's ability to grapple with longer-term issues? So the kind of short-term, long-term, and social versus environmental and technical.
I agree with that perspective. I mean, that's one of the arts of crafting policy is how do you make sure that there are immediate benefits, and particularly for people who are suffering. And I think that during the Great Recession, the emphasis of the green stimulus was on jobs as well as on greening. And sometimes those short-term versus long-term things were conflated, and sometimes we lost track of it. And I think quite rightly, we emphasized a lot more the issue of trying to create immediate jobs, particularly that's why so much was emphasized on energy efficiency and so forth. I think moving forward now, if we're going to talk about greening the economy, we have to be very conscious of what does it mean in terms of wages, jobs, what other social programs are needed to make it work. That's why this idea of a carbon tax or other taxes and then a dividend is very powerful. And also some other ways in order to invest in people rather than just invest in the environment. And so I think that as we start to develop these type of policies and plans, we must think what are the short-term gains, particularly for those who are hurting the most and the most vulnerable groups in our society. That's got to be part of the equation. So thanks for that question.
Can I just, I think
Briefly.
the whole purpose of the Green New Deal as it was currently introduced is the social side. That's the value of it. It brings in that element of the conversation in a way no one else has, which is also why it's being so aggressively criticized. So the understanding that you have as a teacher of that isn't shared in our political class, which is why the pushback on it is so fierce. But that doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it where we are today.
Last word, Doug.
Yeah, I think
Quickly.
I think it can absolutely be put in everyday terms for people who are struggling, and I think that the best legislation during the most difficult times in our national history has done that. And I think that there are questions we can ask, questions like, what if you never had to pay an insurance premium again? What if you never had to worry about paying for medical treatment for your children again? Those are the kinds of things that can resonate with everyday folks dealing with real problems.
Okay, I'd like you all to join me in thanking our panelists.